I grew up in a sundown town. Does anyone know what that is?
Yeah, there was some right here.
It's where the people of color had to leave before the sun set.
It's a town well known by people of color. In my town, if you were a person of color, you needed to be out of town by sundown or it wouldn't be safe for you. My father took pride in living in this town in southern Illinois where I grew up only with white people. My father was a racist, not in the outside world where people could hear him, but inside of himself, inside of our home, inside with other extended family when we gathered together. Trigger alert. My father took pride in the fact that in our small town, people of color did not live there. In fact, he took so much pride in the fact that in 1926, the last year a family of color had tried to live in our town, their house was burned down and they never returned. Our town got a reputation then for people of color and they didn't come back, at least while I lived there. I've heard from sources that in the early 1990s, people of color began to move in. I haven't been back, so I don't know. I haven't gone back since my parents passed away. So I really don't have any knowledge of how that town is today. This was far past redlining. It included an entire city of 40,000 people. East St. Louis was just miles away and began to be heavily populated with people of color. I didn't know it then, but I was watching prisons of our own making. My father believed that people of color deserved to be in jail, that people of color committed all the crimes and lived up to the stereotypes he had set in his mind. They weren't allowed to live there, and that town had the power to enforce that belief. It's how the laws were created to keep people of color enslaved in a different way. Prison is the only form of public housing that the government has truly invested in over the past 5 decades. So says Mark Lamont Hill. Hill is an American academic, author, activist, and television personality. He is a professor of media studies and urban education at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You may have heard of him or seen him on various talk shows and news shows. As some background, Hill was fired from CNN as a commentator a while ago for what they deemed, he said, were anti-Semitic statements when he spoke in front of the United Nations. He was blamed for conflating legitimate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and then convincing news outlets to do the same. He's known also for his latest book, Nobody: Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable, from Ferguson to Flint and beyond. But that's an entirely different sermon. I just wanted to give you some background on him as I have quoted him extensively today. Our prison system is skewed. There is no doubt about that. Many books have been written. Much has been talked about with the inequality of our jailing and conviction system. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, came out almost 9 years ago, and the statistics within it are already obsolete. Her premise, however, is still relevant and still the same. Her premise that when one system of control collapses, another is created to take its place is still in effect today. Those who are most committed to racial hierarchy search for new means to achieve their goals within the rules of the game as currently defined, she stated. During periods of uncertainty where there may be backlash, and it appears some progress is being made, a new form of racialized control begins to take hold. We have a caste system, she says. I've always thought that, economically, growing up as I did, but we have a racial caste also, and we have a system that keeps it intact. The latest statistics I could find shows that there are over 2 million people in prisons, jails, and detention centers in the U.S. This represents 25% of all inmates in the world, though the U.S. population makes up only 5% of the global population. Of these, 846,000 are black men that are imprisoned. Black men are 6.5% of our country's population, but they are 40.2% of the prison population. For children in this country who have an incarcerated mother or father, 1 in 15 are black children. 1 in 111 are white children. And for juveniles, we are spending $88,000 a year incarcerating a juvenile, while only $9,000 a year is spent on educating a student. There seems to be some inequities here. We all know that. We all know that this system isn't working. We can keep writing books, we can keep watching talk shows, listen to the reformers talk about how things should change, but we've been doing that, and nothing seems to be changing. In fact, as Alexander stated, when one system collapses, another one pops up in its place. We seemed to be making headway a few years ago. More press was being played regarding prison reform, and then we had an election, and the system seems to be locking down once again. If the system was fair, would I be okay with prison? Asks Mark Lamont Hill. I'm saying that if the system was fair, there would be no prison. He goes on to say in an interview on Vlad TV, the problem is the entire system is designed in such a way that it can't do anything but yield injustice to us. He's a black man. Because that's why we don't say anymore, I encourage people not to say, the system is broken. Because that implies that we can tweak it, we can reform it, we can make it something other than it is. We need to stop saying that the system is broken and we need to make it work. We need to start saying the system is working and we need to break it. Amen. He wants to live in a society with no police at all. That would be an ideal world for him. And what he goes on to explain is that you have to imagine a world without prisons, where we imagine a world where we see human beings as a site for investment and love. He says before we can envision a world without cops and without prisons, you have to invest in things that are less likely to force people to commit crimes. Invest in food, clothing, shelter, literacy, like Head Start programs, creating environmental standards that are safer, creating resources for those who are on the wrong side of social life, treating drug addiction as a medical problem instead of a criminal problem. When white people get addicted to opioids, all of a sudden it's an epidemic and people need help and need to be treated. But when people of color are addicted to crack or heroin, they're thrown into jail. If we could change these things, then we wouldn't need prison in the way we do now. How can we address those folks who do commit crimes? We can use other resources we are reluctant to use. Throwing someone into prison is easy. Then we don't have to deal with that person out of sight, out of mind. But what about new ways of resolving injustice, using community dispute resolution, restitution, giving back maybe what it was that you stole? I worked in Los Angeles with the LA County Bar Association as a pro bono mediator with the neighborhood of West Hollywood. We would come to a resolution by sitting down with a third party, me, the mediator, and talking it out, rather than them getting into a fight, causing vandalism, or even worse. It worked, and it was a free service. I always came out of there with an agreement between those two parties. We can have them give community service. You can pay for whatever it is that you stole or destroyed. Give mental health care for those folks who kill someone or rape someone. There's something obviously wrong when someone can harm another human being in such a way that it is abhorrent to our species. Locking them up without rehabilitation changes nothing. Lamont Hill says, this is how you can begin to make people whole again. You don't need prison then. His solution is to treat the issue, get justice, then make the world whole. It's a whole new way to look at criminal justice. We have grown to be a world where we confuse justice with punishment, and punishment with confinement. When I lived in Philadelphia, I toured Eastern State Penitentiary. It's a major tourist attraction these days, and on Halloween they do put on a spectacular haunted house. But when I toured it, the audio tour gave out fascinating information. It was the first penitentiary built in the United States, and it was originally intended to give people a chance to give penance for their crimes. It was built in the shape of a star, where all the hallways emanated from the center of one building, and each hallway was used for a specific purpose. Prisoners were put into a room, sometimes even given Bibles by the Quakers in the area, and encouraged to have deep reflection. It was innovative. It was built in 1829 after consultation in Philadelphia with current leaders of the time, including Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a Universalist. Dr. Rush wanted to take his Enlightenment thinking and use it for good, believing that this prison could be made so as to allow prisoners to reflect on what they had done and create a penitent heart so that they would leave an enlightened man. It was, by the way, originally only for male prisoners. So that's why we use the name penitentiary, a place where people can become penitent and learn the errors of their way to return to society a transformed person. We don't use it that way anymore. I don't believe we have a prison that focuses on the prisoner becoming penitent and finding enlightenment. As Lamont Hill said, we are more focused on punishment, as if that will help any human being. Hill says that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it didn't abolish prisons. In fact, according to the 13th Amendment, when it comes to prisons, slavery is still allowed. So what he says happened is when slavery was abolished, you still needed slaves to work to keep the economy going. You don't have slaves anymore, unless someone commits a crime. So what do we do but make everything a crime? The slave codes became the black codes, he says. So now black people can be arrested for vagrancy, for standing outside, for cursing in front of a woman, for speaking to a white woman, for not having a job. So then they create the convict lease system where prisons can lease the convicts back to the plantations where they just left to do the same work that they did as slaves. So the slaves became free only to become slaves again in prison. Michelle Alexander was right. When one system collapses, another one rises in its place. I didn't know this about our American history. That is still the system that we have right now. And they are trying to make prisons private and for profit, and that's how capitalism works. We have to exploit people to keep the economy humming. We have an organization right now in Oakland who is currently looking into our Alameda County Sheriff's Department and calling for an audit of Sheriff Ahern due to the appalling conditions that they are finding in our county jail. People are dying while in custody, and they want to do something about it. That is something we can do. Since he is an elected official, their only recourse is an audit. The Ella Baker Center for Human Rights is being supported by the First Church of Oakland, and they are calling for an audit. And that is something we as a community can participate in. It's a local action that could have farther-reaching consequences. See me after the service if you wish to learn more about it. It could be a beginning in changing the system that Hill wants to see abolished. I agree. What an incredible vision that is to one day eliminate prisons. We know what the solutions are. We just have to fight to create them. It may feel like Sisyphus, and it will be difficult. But there are ways to create change, and we have young leaders like Michelle Alexander and Mark Lamont Hill who are pointing out to us exactly what needs to be done. We just need to go out and do it. I couldn't change my racist father before he died. And there are many folks in this country that believe the way he did. My father was a prisoner in his own mind. In believing his racist views, he locked himself up in a way that made him a prisoner. We just have to work around people like my father. Maybe once we begin to change the system, it will change the minds of those who believe as he did. Follow Mark Lamont Hill's lead. To treat the issue, get justice, make the world whole. We can continue Dr. Benjamin Rush's vision and expand it. It could be the age of enlightenment all over again. May it be so. Blessed be.